Okay, so this evening I'm going to talk to you about the project that we've been working on at Knole for the National Trust, which is a long-running project, so there are going to be a lot of pictures. I hope that's okay. It's quite hard to fit everything in. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Knole, we're just starting off with a view from the early 18th century, just showing the house at its sort of full extent with the formal gardens, and you can see some of the parkland around the outside. So just to put it in context, Knole in its origin is a mid-15th century, probably manor house, acquired by Thomas Bourchier, Archbishop of Canterbury, then acquired by Henry VIII in that way that he had from Thomas Cranmer. It remains as a royal palace until the early 17th century when it passes to the Sackville family, to Thomas Sackville, and it has remained in the ownership of the Sackville family since then. So the family still live on site in part of the property, and the way it is organised is the National Trust owns the house and part of the park, I think it's about 100 acres of the 1,000-acre park. The garden and the remainder of the estate still belong to the Sackville family. So we're working very closely with the donor family throughout this project. So the project actually began as long ago as 2011 when we had a 2-year, £3.5 million programme of urgent repair works to the exterior of the building. Now those of you who came on the very wet visit that Tim was referring to, this was the view that we looked at as we sheltered under as many umbrellas as we could find. Looking back, so we're looking at the east front of the house here. The aim of the sort of urgent repair works, the Knole in Flux programme as it was called, which made it sound like we were having a terrible kind of stomach ailment for a couple of years, but the idea was to try and explain to our visitors why what they were seeing was a bit different to normal. So we had a huge scaffolding that wrapped around the building and moved over a 2-year period. We removed probably about 3 acres of Knole's 7 acres of roof. We also removed all of the render on the eastern face of the building that you can see in this image. So the scaffolding in itself was rather one of the wonders of the project. It didn't touch the building at all. It wasn't anchored to the building, so it actually landed on either side in the garden and in the courtyard. So every single time it moved, it was a whole engineering project in itself. And it was weighted down by all of those water tanks that you can see in the image there, which we did have a weight equivalent, which was always calculated in elephants, and I can't remember how many elephants it is now, but it was a lot of elephants. And there you can see some of the project team from that first phase of works. So Nick from W.W. Martins, who are our contractors, the project manager Richard Hill, our curator Emma Slocum, and our conservator Siobhan Barrett. So these 2 pictures just give you literally a snapshot of some of the issues that we faced as the render came off. Now, what we discovered was that the render had been applied in the late Victorian period. It was a very hard, very cementitious render, so the building was unable to breathe, and we had a lot of water coming in behind the render, and you can see some of the problems with the timber framing that resulted from that. You can also see on the left-hand side of the slide where an earlier attempt at repair work had been made. So this was an ongoing issue. And where we had the most severe problems was where we had drainage actually from the lead hoppers, which had been failing and running down the front of the building. So these were some of the sort of areas of concern and areas that were repaired by the skilled craftsmen who were working on site. We took the opportunity to record the building in as much detail as we could, and Museum of London Archaeology were our contractors for this phase of building works. So here you can see their full drawing of the eastern range superimposed onto an earlier photographic image by Downland, just so you can see where the different sort of parts of the building join together. What was obvious quite early on was what at first presents itself as quite a unified eastern front is the result of at least 8 phases of construction over several hundred years. So while it now looks very kind of neat and tidy, it's actually been through a number of different iterations in order to get to the image that we now see in front of us. Just to pick out one discovery from that phase, what you can see here are the parts of a window surround, which actually are not only decorative but also structural. So these are early 16th century overload moulded, I believe, timber window framing, which run all the way from the first floor right up into the second floor. So as well as being decorative, as I said, they form part of the actual structure, and we didn't know that they were there. So that was a rather sort of nice discovery, and has enabled Mola to produce a suggested reconstruction of how the eastern front of the building looked around the time of Archbishop Wareham in the early 16th century. So quite different to how it looks today. We're still having some discussions with them around whether that roof line is correct, and also because they hadn't worked in the interior of the building at this stage, we had no indications of chimneys or heating or how this sort of range functioned. We were literally just looking at the exterior. So this is the sort of programme of works, a fairly rapid programme over 2 years, and each of the different colours of shading shows the phases of roof as they came off. And this image here shows just phase 1.1. So that's the first phase of work. It's an image by John Miller, and gives you an idea of the scale of this project. So all of the tiles were removed, the battens were removed where repairs were required. It was re-waterproofed, and then the tiles were reattached, so as much recycling as possible. And similar to the work on the eastern facade, we also realised that there are an awful lot of phases of construction within this roof, so everything from late medieval all the way through to 20th century flat roofing. So about 20 different phases of construction represented across the southern and eastern ranges. You're not supposed to have favourites, but this is one of my favourite bits. This is the roof of the old kitchen, which is part of the property that still remains in Lord Sackville's ownership or lease. And you can see there we've got decorative wind braces within this medieval structure. So our suggestion is that originally this roof was open all the way to the pitch, and you would have been able to see these decorative features, and then subsequently the ceiling height has been dropped internally, and that's what you can see below a easel there from Mola, who's recording in the roof spaces. Fines. So essentially we were excavating this building, and we worked very closely with the contractors to monitor the artefacts that were coming out. A lot of them were natural in origin, so there are a lot of wasp nests up there and a lot of birds' nests, which you won't be surprised to learn about. But there are also quite a lot of artefacts found during the sort of clearing out of roof voids. This was one of the first that was found, a deliberately left item, matchbox with two people's names inside, and it actually has a date on the side of 1949. So someone, when they're working up there, has left these items for us to find. And this is a bit of a theme that will carry on through this talk. Other finds. This is from the kitchen roof. So again, we're starting to get a picture of the kinds of activities that might be taking place up in the roof spaces at Knole. And lots and lots and lots and lots of smoking paraphernalia, we were calling it. So everything from the bunny ashtray, which obviously is fairly recent. We did ask around to see if anyone would own up to that being their ashtray. They said no. The cigarette papers that you can see at the top there are probably World War I period, and then we have other some 1960s, 1950s packets from various roof spaces across the property. This one is from the West Range when we were doing some electrical works, and again is a deliberately left item. So it's been left by W. Eastwood, who's the plumber from Bessel's Green. He was working at Knole at Christmas in 1931, and I particularly like that Tom White, mate to the above, was only allowed the side of the packet to leave his note to the future. So, as part of the project, we again worked very closely with Museum of London Archaeology to undertake a building survey to make sure that we had a very accurate floor plan and elevations, reflected ceiling plans for the showrooms and also for the new spaces. So we're opening a lot of new spaces at Knole as part of this project. So here you can see Catherine at the west front tying into the wider grid. So now, as I said, for each space we have a detailed floor plan, which has been extremely useful actually for the architects and the structural surveyors and our curators to work out where things like servicing can go, and also has obviously been extremely helpful for the archaeology. We have lovely elevations of each of the spaces as well, and what really is just, again, what originally presents itself as a very uniform building, once you start looking at it in detail, the panelling has all gone in at different dates and times. It's a mixture of things from all kinds of places. They have had no hesitation in the past about moving things around Knole. Bits of panelling, quite a lot of fireplaces move actually, we've discovered, so they start in one room and they move to another. And this picture here shows part of Mola's survey data. So we're looking at sort of the raw survey data from the showrooms. Where the colours are most bright is where we have the most data. So in some areas we only have the first floor, which is where the showrooms are. The ground floor remains Lord Sackville's accommodation essentially. And we have some areas where we have the upper floors now as well, because some of the attic spaces will be open to the public in the future. Now, even in spite of the fact this is a huge amount of data that has been collected, when you put it on a plan of the whole building complex, there's an awful lot more work that could still be done in order to help us sort of record and understand this building fully. The property was assessed as part of a conservation management plan by Oxford Archaeology in 2007, and in 2013 it was revised. So we have a very good basis to work from, and we're testing a lot of their assumptions about different phases of the building. Also, there were 2 PhD projects in the early 2000s by Dr. Ed Town and Dr. Alden Gregory, which has also been extremely useful for the project to help us to try and navigate our way through this huge building. Something that has become a real theme of this project is looking at historic graffiti, and that turned up in the first phase of works. When the render came off the east face, what we're looking at here is actually the back of the panelling for the showrooms, which does explain why it was so cold in there. Helpfully, right on the back of the panelling, we have not only the dates, but also the names of the people who put that plaster on in the first place. So historic graffiti, as I say, at this early stage was something that we'd started to look for and wanted to record. So we've been working very closely with Matthew Champion of MJC Associates, who has been undertaking graffiti surveys across the showrooms and the attic spaces for us. A restart is required. How about you remind me in 4 hours? Excellent. We have all sorts of things recorded on the walls. People seem to have had absolutely no hesitation about writing on the walls of Knole all over the place, not just in the kind of disused areas, but even in the showrooms as well. This is in a room called the Upper King's Room, which we will come back to later, so right above the King's bedroom. We have graffiti that records sort of global events and how they kind of impacted upon Knole. So we have this is an area called the Dog Kennel on the North Range, which is where you go when you want to write something about World War. So let's hope we don't ever have to revisit that area. Not because the graffiti is not interesting, just because we don't want World War III, obviously. This is the Retainers Gallery. So this is a 17th century part of the property, right up in the attic level, and it's part of Thomas Sackville's redesign of Knole from sort of 1603 to 1607. So it's originally a high status leisure space, but what we know is that it goes out of use quite early on, probably doesn't last in its kind of high status incarnation for more than about 100 years, and consequently it becomes a storage area, and there is an awful lot of graffiti up there. There is graffiti everywhere, as I said, when you look for it. We have it on the fireplaces. This is in one of our meeting rooms. This is in the Retainers Gallery. So this is telling us about servicing of the house. It says the temporary gas pipe for the Great Hall, Hunt Ball, January the 8th, 1895. So it's a very specific reference there to an event, and just shows the kind of the wealth and importance that you could have temporary gas installed just for an event, so that's rather nice. We have some earlier 18th century graffiti as well. This is actually on the window glass on the second painted stair lobby. We have Samuel Ball, who's a lead worker or a plumber. Below him we have George, the housemaid. and then there's John, I think, Fowler or Foster underneath them. So these are tiny, just scratched, but again in part of the sort of main showrooms area. So Knole in Flux finished in 2013, and then in preparation for our sort of major project works, we had a phase of enabling works over the winter of 2013 to 14. So a starting look essentially at the showrooms, the routes that we could bring in new services. So the idea is to make the building envelope watertight and weatherproof, and then to move into the interior and to start looking at installing better environmental control for the collections. So here you can see James Wright from Museum of London Archaeology working in the spangled bedroom. And James did a lot of work for us during this period of time. One area that he particularly focused on was the Upper King's Room that we mentioned already, which is at the top in this space here, which will also be open in 2019. This is what it looked like, and this is largely how the public will see it when it is reopened, actually, because we don't know anything about how this room was originally dressed in the 17th century. We have nothing to take it back to as such. It has been used for storage for a very long time. You can see that there have been some quite serious structural issues in that space. The roof there here is been repaired and replaced within living memory. So as recently as the 1960s, we have original surviving 17th century beams at the top there. And there's also an awful lot of rebuild around the windows. So we've lost a lot of original features here, but there is enough to tell us about some of the hints around how this room looked in the 17th century structurally, if not decoratively. We have had some tree ring dating from this space, from the ceiling beams and the floor beams. Very, very tight dates returned for the winter of AD 1605 to 6, and that's replicated in 2 samples. So we're pretty confident that we're looking at the 17th century infrastructure that was installed within a medieval tower. What James discovered in this space was that the 17th century structure, as I said, remains in situ. So we have carpenter's marks running in sequence along the floor joists and the beams, but he also discovered a whole series of other marks in this space, which are ritual protection marks or apotropaic symbols that you can see marked on the drawing there. So we're looking at one of the floor beams in plan here. And the sequence of ritual protection marks appears to be marked by a series of scorch marks. They are followed by these scratched, incised marks. Has everyone heard of witch marks or ritual protection marks? Who will come across this concept? Excellent. So the idea being that you are adding a layer of protection to the occupant of that space. So you are protecting someone who sleeps in that room from nasty things that can come in through openings, so through doors, through windows, and down the fireplace. So all of these ritual protection marks that we have scratched onto this 17th century beam are clustered around the fireplace, so they are protecting someone from nasties coming down. So that just shows you the location. This is the fireplace here, and this is the beam with all the marks on. Now, as I said, the beginning of the sequence is marked by this series of scorch marks which lie horizontally. Now, it's not possible to create scorch marks horizontally when this beam was in situ. So what we know is that the scorch marks must have been added at the time of construction. So it's very unusual to be able to date apotropaic marks in this way, but because we know the timber dates to 1605 to 6, we know that the marks have gone in through the evidence of the scorch mark at the same time. We believe that these are all sort of a piece with the construction of the building. So this is Thomas Sackville, and he was sort of redeveloping Knole in anticipation of a royal visit. So he was hoping that James I would come and visit. Now, James I was pretty au fait with the world of witches and demons. He'd even written a book, and he believed that his life had previously been the subject of a plot by witches. So he was well informed on his demonology. Of course, in 1605, we have the events of the Gunpowder Plot, so our suggestion is that these marks are being installed in the immediate aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot. So there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of sort of, threats to the king, there are liturgies, there are sermons being preached about the evils of Catholicism and linking it very closely with the Pope. So we are suggesting that these witch marks were installed by the carpenters in order to protect James should he be sleeping in that room, or one of his high status retainers or a member of his family. We think this is a correct interpretation. We'll never know for sure. We are certain, however, that they are not carpenter's marks because we have all of those represented as well. Additionally, Lord Sackville, when he heard about this, said, "Oh, I remember an old shoe that was found in the fireplace in the 1960s. I wonder if we've still got it." And they do indeed still have it. So as an additional layer of ritual protection in this space, in the mid-17th century, someone went and put a leather shoe behind the fireplace. Shoes are again a sort of common apotropaic symbol, so they help to ward off evil by essentially leaving a little bit of a human in the space that otherwise would be occupied by demons. We haven't sadly found any witch bottles so far. We keep hoping that we might find one. We have found quite a lot of dead animals, but not cats so far. But it's interesting to think about this sort of idea of things coming down the chimney, because obviously in modern day context we have quite a different understanding of things that come down chimneys, but you still leave a stocking up, don't you? So there's still this shoe link. Once you start looking, there are marks all over Knole, so there are scratch marks under the floor of the Spangled Bedroom, under the cartoon gallery. There are hexafoils or daisy wheels in Stable Court, in Lady Betty's room, in the Retainers Gallery. They are all over the place, and in the Great Hall. So we are currently in our Heritage Lottery funded phase of works. It's the largest conservation project in the National Trust, £14.5 million project, of which £7.75 million has been provided by the Heritage Lottery Fund. We have undertaken some limited excavation. This is again James, he's working in a test pit out the west front, and we have some nice evidence for 17th century activity there, probably around the Civil War period, looking at the dates of the clay pipe. So this was for part of the British Telecom servicing actually. We have converted the medieval barn on site into a conservation studio, so we've again had some limited investigation below the floor. And this is one of the medieval drains below the barn. This photo was taken by me in the medieval drain, which will give you an idea of the size. And they still do work, so you have to time your visit to the medieval drains quite carefully. So this is the barn as it looked. So it was damaged by a very severe fire in the 1880s. And the idea of the project was to reinstate an echo of the original medieval roofline. So there you can see Lord Sackville adding one of the last tiles, and works in progress with the pitch of the new roof visible there. And that is what it looks like now. And the interior looks like this. So it's a working conservation studio. So a lot of the collections from the house are now being worked on in the conservation studio. We've also done some work in the outer wicket, so the first tower that you come to when you visit Knole. This is a view from a cherry picker looking down onto the roof. This was the area where Eddie, Lord Sackville, lived, so the gentleman who inherited instead of Vita, Sackville West, her cousin, and he actually didn't like Knole very much, so he lived almost as far as he could away from the hub of things without actually living out of the palace. So he lived in the outer wicket, and then it was subsequently occupied by one of the estate managers, Mr. Mason. So you can now visit these spaces, which have been redecorated, well, they're repopulated with Eddie's collection. So we have a lot of his books and things like gramophones. We did some investigation under the floor there, and this is some nice evidence of a lived space. So we have various items that could relate to Eddie or could relate to Mr. Mason, but show that someone was actually living in those rooms. So stage 3 was the stage which covered the first half of the showroom. So throughout this property, we have remained throughout this project, rather, we have remained open to the public. So we've had half the showrooms closed. We've been working on them. They are now reopened, and we're in the second half of the showrooms. So in order to do that, we had to decant all of the material out, including all of the very large pictures in the Great Hall. So this is the Wootton Dover Castle picture being removed from the Great Hall. And the Great Hall became our temporary store for a year. It literally was only there for a year, so it's kind of passed into the era of myth and legend. If you didn't see it then it's gone. But it was full of gold and shiny, wonderful things, and gave people the opportunity to look at our collections much more close up, which was really great. This is the kind of changing styles image. So this is from the second painted stair lobby, and at the top you can see the early 18th century redecoration, and at the bottom, normally hidden under panelling, is some of the original Sackville decoration from the early 17th century. So when things went out of style, we had a big phase of redecoration in the early 18th century, which in this instance stops halfway up the nearest flight of stairs. So it shows us that people were no longer using those stairs to access the retainers gallery, because they only redecorated as far as you can see from the lobby. This is the ballroom without any collections in it, so an amazing opportunity to see the sort of 17th century decoration of the room. And this is the ballroom work in progress. We removed nearly all of the panelling in this room to install fire protection, insulation, and a new lighting scheme. So the panelling is in huge pieces in this space, and actually is earlier than the floor. So in order to be able to remove the panelling, it had to be lifted above the current floorboards and then dropped down. So a huge project from our contractors there. Removal of the panelling sometimes did reveal some unexpected surprises. So a door that everyone and many, many visitors have been merrily walking underneath for many years was actually not particularly structurally sound. There were a series of wooden lintels that had all rotted in situ, so that all had to be replaced. And also some of the earlier decorative features probably relating to the medieval phases of the building. So under the eastern wall of the ballroom, looking over into Pheasant Court, there were originally 3 huge windows. So what is now quite a dark space was once a much, much lighter space with a whole series of large windows, including a bay window. Again, working with Matthew, evidence for graffiti. This is on the back of the main door into the screens passage. So someone has used this flat area to work out some designs, probably again in the 17th century. And the screens passage itself is covered in ritual protection marks of all different shapes and sizes. We have some evidence as well for medieval text on the Reynolds room door. So this actually says Tom, and the best reading we have for the surname underneath is Bourchier, but that's probably too good to be true, that Archbishop Bourchier was writing his name on the wall, but we're going with that. The cartoon gallery, the cartoons were removed for conservation. The café upon which they sit was left in situ, apart from the very top part, which was rolled down, which again revealed part of the early 17th century decorative scheme. So what we're looking at here is the picture framing from Thomas Sackville's original design of the cartoon gallery, and the picture on the right shows one of the portraits from the Brown Gallery, which originally would have hung in the cartoon gallery. So from some of the fixings, we've been able to work out exactly where some of these pictures hung. And there is Mola's plan, showing this whole row of portraits that would have been looking down upon you when you came into this very important and very high status space. Again, more graffiti within the wall void. So in the 17th century they basically narrowed and opened up, if that makes sense. So they narrowed the gallery, and they took out the partitions between the medieval rooms and created the cartoon gallery. So what we have hiding in one of the wall voids is part of the medieval building, with Victorian graffiti, but also with a whole series of, again, ritual protection marks, but in this case, burn marks. So the idea of these is that you burn a little bit of your building in the hopes that the rest of it won't burn down. So you're kind of inoculating your building, essentially. And there are a whole sort of bunch of these in that bit of medieval timber framing. They're not related to candles being used in that space, as there's no fixings or anything on the wall to hold a candle. And once again, you start looking for them, they are all over the property. So we have them in the Spangled Bedroom, Lord Sackville has them on the screen in the chapel. They are repeated across the building. As are the ritual protection marks. These are in the Great Hall, so an area that's very heavily visited, but until you shine a light on them, you can't see them, but they are all over the panelling and all over the screen. So when you put lots and lots of little dots on the map, you can see that Knole is very well protected indeed from any witches, demons or unexpected fire events. So as part of the project, as well as all the recording that has been undertaken by Museum of London Archaeology, we've been working with a big volunteer group from Knole. About 60 people so far have been trained in archaeological methods and techniques, and they've been undertaking the finds retrieval for us, so essentially the excavation underneath the floorboards as areas are lifted to allow for new services. Again, a bit of a theme, quite a lot more smoking related items. This one is actually from the King's Room, so those of you who visited Knole will know what a sort of important space that is, and the incredible collections that are in there, silver furniture, a state bed, but in this space not only did we find a cigarette packet, we actually found that someone had a cigarette and put it out in there, and that's just astonishing in a modern context to think that people would have been smoking, but obviously in the past it would have been absolutely fine, no problem at all. This is from the Reynolds room, so a little bit of evidence here that people might have been eating and drinking in this space. So we've got what I think is a bird bone, we need a specialist to look at it. We've got an oyster shell, this at the bottom here is a cork for a wine bottle. We've got some fragments of textiles that have probably come from furniture, and then we also have later things like a 1900s tube ticket and a 1972 Greek postage stamp. So a real mixture from that space. We know that the Reynolds room was occasionally used as a dining room in the past, so it's quite nice to see a little bit of evidence to show that they may have left bits behind. This is one of our star finds. This is a 17th century letter found under the floorboards. The date is October 1633, and it's part of the collection that was moved to Knole in the 18th century from Copt Hall. So it's actually a letter from one steward to another, so from Robert Draper to his friend Bilby, and it's like an Amazon wish list essentially. He was saying, please can you send all of these various things, so some new frying pans, some fire shovels, new lights for my Lady Cranfield's chamber. So we think that these documents moved to Knole from Copt Hall in the 18th century when all of the chattels moved, and they were stored in the attics, and over time a number of them fell out and fell beneath the floorboards. We actually have 3 from this area. They were conserved by Jan Kutejar, who's from University College London. And these ones, also we made it in the paper with these ones, the idea of a 400-year-old shopping list is something that really appealed. Knole is also featured on the Secrets of the National Trust programme with Alan Titchmarsh. You can watch it on Catch Up until the 14th of March, if you are interested. While they were actually filming, we didn't realise, but this panel that came out, it was insulating part of the electrical cabling, is actually an artefact directly associated with Vita Sackville West. So it's part of the decorative scheme of one of her rooms at Knole, probably painted by herself and friends. So that's quite a nice find. That's in the needlework store now. And as I said, our curator has been using the archaeological survey data to help with the representation and the picture hang at Knole. So this is the ballroom with some of the pictures in slightly different locations. And this is what it looks like now. So the Wootton has moved from the Great Hall up into the ballroom. We did a short phase of work in an area called the Pigeon Lofts. This is our blue phase. It was very cold. And these are, again, lived spaces. These were staff quarters. So we have some shoes from under the floorboards here. We have some little bottles. We're still to go through this assemblage in detail. This is the stage we are currently in. So stage 5 of Inspired by Knole. So we're working on the eastern side of the house. So the brown gallery onwards, and all of the showrooms on that side of the property up to the Venetian ambassador's bedroom. All sorts of features come into light. This is in the museum room. So we've taken out all of the cases that were in that space, and this is an area where we're now going to be able to tell a little bit of the story of the history of Knole. So we have some medieval fabric that's of the building that's going to be left exposed in this space. The fireplace was a bit of a surprise because when we took the blocking away, it turned out that the fireplace was no longer there. So this is another one of these moving fireplaces. It's in one of Lord Sackville's rooms now, but we didn't know that until we did that. We found doors that we didn't know were quite as big as they are. So that's Robin, our building surveyor, standing next to a door in the corner of the Venetian ambassador's room, which presumably was a door they were using to bring in tapestries and large bits of furniture. And this is the Brown Gallery with most of its panelling off, and Robin looking very pleased in the corner there. This has been one of the most fascinating areas because, again, we've been able to take almost all, I think in fact 100% of the panelling has now come off in this space. So we can see areas where we've got brickwork blocking, which we weren't aware of, which appears to have been built up behind the panelling, so possibly blocking an earlier stair, we think, in this case. We've got evidence for quite a severe fire that, again, we didn't know was there, so we've got a really very charred series of timbers running through here, which have been retained and then just simply added to and built around. So we think we've got evidence for a medieval fire there. And we've got a whole series of doors, so a number of the late medieval timber frame doors have been revealed underneath the 17th century panelling. So this is the one most recently revealed, but there are two others. Same as in the showrooms, this is in the corner of Lady Betty's room. So we're now able to start thinking about how people were moving through the building in the medieval period. So before the showrooms route was established. So Knole is a show house and has an enfilade cut down the eastern side of that range so that you can walk through and view these spaces. But that's not how people would have been viewing them in the medieval, or living in them in the medieval period. So finds from under the floorboards. We had high hopes that we would have lots and lots of undisturbed deposits, but actually we now know that through the 1970s and 80s there was quite a lot of conservation work and repair work being undertaken by some of the estate workers who we have met and talked to, and who have very sort of sadly said, we're really sorry about all the areas we hoovered. So we know that we've lost some of the deposits, but in some areas we have still made some really fantastic finds. So from one of the attic spaces we have this really lovely example of an 18th century clay pipe, very complete, continuing with our smoking theme really. This was an exciting day. So this is Will and Jake from the contracting team, HB&C, and 4 of our archaeology team members, Jim, Brenda, Deb and Sue, holding one of their finds. Now, I don't know if you can see right in the bottom there, this. This was retrieved using a slightly unusual method. We actually hoovered it out of the void space that it was in. It's quite a deep void, that, and no one was going to be able to get in there, so we used a hoover to lift it out extremely carefully, and this is what it was. So it's a Perrier. The design of Perrier bottles has changed very little over time. This is actually a very early 20th century bottle, and most excitingly, it had a message inside it. On the back of the message it said, "Take this out and see inside." It's an invitation to do so. And the message reads, September 26, 1906, this bottle was dropped here in the year AD 1906 by S.G. Doggett when these radiators were put in, and also the hot water service. Which is a wonderful, wonderful thing to have found. And we've been able to find out quite a lot about Sid Doggett, mainly because he's a prolific writer on the walls. He worked at Knole for over 60 years, so he started working there in the 1890s, and he didn't retire until 1960. And he recorded, as you can see, many, many, many times in the same place, but not just in one same place. He actually revisited a whole series of places and left his name, which is an amazing thing to be able to find out about someone. This is another example. This is a 1930s example from Laundry Cottage, where again he's left his name. And through our oral history project, which is run by the Knole volunteers, that we were able to get in touch with his surviving family, who came in and saw his letter in a bottle and have also donated his toolbox to the property. So we've got this wonderful story about Sid Doggett. Through the power of social media, we did also tweet Perrier and say, guess what we found? An early 20th century bottle, and they sent us lots of Perrier water and a message in a bottle, which was really very sweet of them. So, some other sort of nice finds that we have from the attic spaces, so probably used as servants' quarters through the Victorian period. We've got this lovely cold cream lid, which in the world of pot lids is a very exciting example. There's a gentleman out there who is writing a book on pot lids, and he's seen 7,000 of them, and he'd never seen one like that. So that was pretty exciting. So probably 1890s, he thinks. Buttons, beads, hairpins, coins, all sorts of sort of, again, personal items. This is one of our earliest finds, if not the earliest. This is a Nuremberg jeton or token. It's a Hans von Krauwinkel, the second, I believe, so late 16th, early 17th century, found by Adam from HB&C. Possibly, again, deliberately left. It was on the junction between the Spangled Bedroom and the Brown Gallery, so under a sort of, well, next to a fireplace, in a rat's nest, so might have moved around a bit. They're quite an interesting item. You find them a lot. They're not rare, but they come up all over the country, but actually in Kent, they are, funnily enough, slightly rarer. So this is from the Portable Antiquities Scheme, just showing the spread of those that have been reported to the PAS, and Sevenoaks is actually is a blank on their map at the moment, so we can add a dot to the map there. These are our volunteers lying down on the job as ever. So we're working here in the Spangle bedroom, a very sort of detailed bit of finds recording, because we were trying to retrieve something very, very small. I don't know if you can see them, but we have tiny little artefacts here. These are spangles from the Spangled bed, and we did retrieve hundreds of them actually in the end. They are gold and silver, so they originally would have been attached to the bed hanging, and there is the bed itself. It's currently away for conservation. And as well as the spangles, we also found even tinier things. We've got a tiny little bead which might be a seed pearl there as well. So a really detailed piece of recording there. Again, fragmentary letters. This was from the Spangled bedroom, and we've actually got the words Copt Hall there on a very damaged bit of letter. But the Spangled bed originally came from Copt Hall, so to find something that says Copt Hall next to the Spangled bed was pretty amazing. That was quite exciting. And this is what the Spangled bed hangings look like, so during the conservation process. So you can see where the little spangles have dropped off. So we're back in the cartoon gallery. One of our sort of latest pieces of work was to fill in the remainder of the picture frames there. So we had another bit of Caffoy removed. And again, you can see the picture frames still survive, and also some of the sort of tiny decorative details, these little pendants that still survive on some of those areas. It's a really sort of stunning scheme, and it's quite a shame we have to put it all back really, but don't tell anyone I said that. As I said, we've been working a lot, supported by the Heritage Lottery funding, with our volunteers, as the training programme is called Knole Archaeology Unwrapped. And we have a really amazing group of volunteers who've been working with us since 2014. They do all kinds of things, as well as working on site. So here we have Graham working with Dan, our site foreman from HB&C, under the floorboards. They also help to support guided tours behind the scenes. So we've done a lot of tours onto the work site over the last 3 or 4 years. They do outreach events, so both on-site and also taking out into the local community. This is at Sevenoaks Museum. We run a lecture programme at Knole as well, so this is Ed Town presenting on the archaeology of paintings a few months ago. And they've also been doing a lot of sieving, so when the panelling is removed, a lot of dust tends to fall out, and the contractor's been collecting that for us, and our wonderful volunteers have been sieving this material just to make sure we don't miss anything. Some slightly unexpected finds from the park. This was found during one of our training courses, just lying on the surface of an area of the park called Echo Mount, which is where we think we may have a previously unidentified Bronze Age barrow. So Al Oswald from the University of York has been doing some landscape survey, and he's been looking a lot at the prehistoric landscape. These we think are modern finds. They were lying on the surface, so there is the potential for some modern pagan activity going on this site as well, in the form of these little features. We run an annual archaeology day each year as part of the Festival of Archaeology, particularly more recently aimed at families to get them involved and engaged with the archaeology of the property. And again, our volunteers help support that, talking about the work that they've been doing over the last few years. So, as our sort of one of the legacies we're leaving behind for this project, we hope is a really inspired and committed group of people, inspired by Knole literally, talking about the archaeology of the building, which is not something that maybe we were talking about at Knole so much before. One of the other things that we are leaving, in sort of honour of all of the deliberate deposits that we found under the floorboards, is a time capsule. So actually we left it originally at the end of the Knole in Flux project, and then we found it again during the Inspired by Knole project. So here's Dan, our site foreman, with the time capsule, which is a lot bigger than I remember it being. So it's actually half empty, so we're going to add some more items to it and then hide it away, and then potentially in the future someone else will find it and learn a bit about the project that we've been doing over the last 6 years. So I'll leave it there.